The cardboard box was already half-taped when I stepped through the front door, the screech of the packing tape slicing through the heavy silence of the foyer like a blade. I stood there, my keys still clutched in my hand, watching my mother-in-law, Svetlana, gesture toward my 75-inch OLED TV, the one I had saved for through 6 months of overtime and a canceled vacation. "Careful with the corners, Artyom," she chirped, her voice dripping with a terrifying domestic sweetness. "Your grandmother's eyes aren't what they used to be, and she needs the high definition for her soaps. Polina won't mind. She's got that big promotion coming up anyway. She can keep my leftover pancakes as a trade." The sheer, casual audacity of it made the world tilt on its axis. My husband didn't look at me. He didn't even flinch. He just kept smoothing the bubble wrap over the screen, his movements mechanical and submissive. It wasn't just about a piece of electronics. It was the realization that in my own home, the sanctuary I had built with my own sweat and blood, I had become a ghost whose consent was no longer required. The smell of Svetlana's signature cinnamon pancakes wafted from the kitchen, a scent that used to mean warmth and family, but now felt like the cloying odor of a trap closing shut. To understand how I ended up a stranger in my own living room, you have to understand the life I thought I was living. For 5 years, Artyom and I had been the golden couple of our social circle. He was a soft-spoken landscape architect with a penchant for sketching trees in the park, and I was a senior analyst at a firm that demanded precision and iron will. We complemented each other, my fire to his water, my drive to his steady, quiet presence. Our apartment was my pride and joy, a sprawling, sun-drenched space in the historic district that I had inherited from my grandfather. It had high ceilings, crown molding that I had hand-stripped of 20 layers of beige paint, and a balcony where we spent our Sunday mornings drinking overpriced coffee and planning a future that seemed written in the stars. I loved the ritual of our life. Every morning, the sunlight would hit the espresso machine at exactly 8 o'clock, creating a little rainbow on the granite countertop. I loved the weight of the heavy linen curtains I'd picked out, the way the floorboards hummed under my feet. It was more than property. It was my anchor. When I married Artyom, I didn't hesitate to let him move in. I wanted to share everything. I wanted our lives to bleed into one another until you couldn't tell where I ended and he began. Svetlana had always been a vivid presence, as Artyom liked to put it. In the beginning, I found her quirks endearing. She was a woman of traditional values who expressed love through food and unsolicited advice. She'd show up on a Tuesday with a Tupperware container of borscht and a gentle suggestion that I should wear more blue because it brought out my eyes. I'd laugh it off, thank her for the soup, and move on. She was just a lonely widow, I told myself. She just wanted to feel needed. "She's just trying to help, Lena," Artyom would say whenever I complained about her rearranging my spice rack or accidentally shrinking one of my silk blouses in the wash. "She doesn't have anyone else. Let's just be the bigger people." And so I became the bigger person. I grew a thicker skin. I accepted the pancakes, the criticisms disguised as concerns, and the way she'd linger in our guest room for just one more night that inevitably turned into a week. I didn't see the way she was slowly measuring the walls, calculating the value of the art, and testing the strength of my boundaries. She was like ivy, beautiful and green at first, but slowly sending out tiny, invisible roots into the brickwork of my marriage, looking for a crack to exploit. The first real hint of the rot came 3 months ago. We were at dinner, and Svetlana was picking at her salad, looking uncharacteristically somber. She started talking about her pension woes and how the roof of her small cottage was practically crying every time it rained. I felt a pang of genuine sympathy and offered to pay for the repairs. "Oh, Polina, you're a saint," she'd whispered, squeezing my hand with a grip that felt surprisingly strong. "But a house is such a burden for an old woman. Maybe I should just sell it and move somewhere more central, somewhere where I can be close to my only son." I remember the way Artyom's eyes lit up, and the way my own stomach did a slow, sickening roll. I brushed it off as nerves. I told myself I was being selfish. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the rhythmic breathing of my husband, I realized the quiet life I had worked so hard for was no longer quiet. There was a third person in the room, a shadow in the corner of our marriage that was growing taller every day. I looked at the TV on the wall, the one I had just bought to celebrate my latest bonus, its dark screen reflecting the moonlight. It looked like a black hole, waiting to swallow everything I owned. I didn't know then that the dismantling of my life had already begun, and that the woman who made the best pancakes in the city was currently deciding which of my possessions would look best in her new home. The weeks following that dinner were marked by a subtle, tectonic shift in the atmosphere of our home. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, suffocating encroachment. Svetlana didn't just visit anymore. She collaborated with our space. I'd come home from a 10-hour shift to find my minimalist ceramics replaced by her porcelain figurines of weeping shepherds. My collection of rare succulents had been moved to the dark hallway because the sun was too aggressive for them, and in their place sat a bowl of wax fruit that smelled vaguely of dust. Artyom became a ghost in his own skin. He stopped looking me in the eye, his gaze always fixed somewhere just past my shoulder. When I tried to initiate a conversation about us, about the weird tension humming through the walls, he'd suddenly find a reason to leave the room. "I'm just stressed at work, Polina. Don't make everything a drama," he'd mutter, his fingers twitching toward his phone. He was constantly texting, the soft click-clack of his typing, a frantic rhythm that filled the gaps in our silence. Then came the questions. Svetlana started asking about the logistics of the apartment. "It's such a shame, all this space for just 2 people," she sighed one afternoon while I was trying to read a report. She was dusting a shelf I had already cleaned. "And the taxes on a place like this in the historic district, they must be astronomical. It's a burden, really. A young woman like you should be traveling, not worrying about plumbing and property levies." "I don't mind the burden, Svetlana," I said, my voice tight. "It was my grandfather's. It's my home." "Of course, dear," she smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. They remained cold, calculating, like an appraiser's. "But is it really a home if it's just an investment sitting still?" Artyom was saying he feels cramped by the responsibility. "He's so sensitive, my boy. He worries about your future together." My heart skipped a beat. Artyom hadn't said a word to me about feeling cramped. In fact, we had spent years talking about how this would be the place where our children would take their first steps. I looked at her, searching for a sign of a joke, but she just turned back to her dusting, humming a low, tuneless melody. The warning bells became a deafening roar a few days later. I was looking for our extra set of car keys in the mahogany sideboard in the hallway, a piece of furniture Artyom usually kept locked. He had forgotten his keys in the lock that morning in his rush to leave. As I pulled the drawer open, I didn't find the keys. I found a thick, manila envelope tucked beneath a stack of old menus. My hands began to tremble before I even opened it. There was a scent clinging to the paper, a mix of Artyom's cologne and Svetlana's heavy floral perfume. Inside was a draft of a legal document. My eyes blurred as I tried to make sense of the legalese. Power of attorney, transfer of title, irrevocable gift. My name was there, but so was Svetlana's. It was a draft for a deed of gift, transferring a 50% share of the apartment to Svetlana in consideration of family support and elder care. Beneath it was a brochure for a luxury retirement community, the kind that cost more than a mid-sized sedan every month, with a handwritten note in Svetlana's loopy, elegant script. "The deposit is due by the 15th. Once the apartment is leveraged, we can move Grandma in there and use the rest for the premium suite. Artyom, make sure she signs the renovation papers instead." The world didn't just tilt, it disintegrated. A cold, viscous wave of nausea rose in my throat. I felt the blood drain from my face so fast, I had to grab the edge of the sideboard to keep from collapsing. My pulse was a frantic hammer against my eardrums, drowning out the sound of the city outside. Renovation papers. That's what Artyom had mentioned last week. He'd told me he wanted to update the electrical wiring and needed me to sign some standard municipal forms so he could handle the contractors while I was at work. He'd been so sweet about it, kissing my forehead and telling me I worked too hard to deal with bureaucracy. I looked at the document again. It wasn't a municipal form. It was a trap designed to strip me of my inheritance and my security, orchestrated by the man who slept beside me and the woman who brought me pancakes. The sound of the front door opening shattered the silence. I didn't hide the papers. I couldn't. I stood there, the manila envelope clutched in my shaking hand, as Artyom walked in, followed closely by Svetlana. They were laughing about something, a shared joke, a secret world I was no longer part of. Artyom saw me first. His smile didn't just fade, it evaporated. He turned a sickly shade of gray, his eyes darting from my face to the papers in my hand. "Lena," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can explain." Svetlana stepped around him, her eyes narrowing as she saw the envelope. She didn't look guilty, she looked annoyed, like I was a child who had found a hidden Christmas present too early. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Artyom," she snapped, her voice losing every trace of its domestic sweetness. "Stop stammering. She was going to find out eventually. Polina, don't look so tragic. It's for the family. We're simply optimizing our assets." "Our assets?" I managed to choke out, the words feeling like shards of glass in my mouth. "This is my house, Svetlana, my grandfather's house. And you were going to trick me into signing it away." I looked at Artyom, desperate for him to say something, to tell me he didn't know, that his mother had acted alone. But he just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his gaze firmly fixed on the floorboards. He looked small. He looked pathetic. And in that moment, the man I loved vanished, replaced by a stranger who had been measuring my coffin while I was still breathing. "It's not like that," Artyom mumbled, his voice so low I could barely hear it. "Mom said, she said it would be better for our taxes, that it would protect us if your firm had layoffs. And the retirement home for your grandmother?" I threw the brochure at his feet. "The premium suite funded by my walls? Was that for our taxes too?" Svetlana stepped forward, her face inches from mine. I could smell the cinnamon on her breath. "Listen to me, you ungrateful girl. You have more than you need, and my family has nothing. You married into this family, which means what's yours is ours. Now put those papers down. We have guests coming over for dinner, and Artyom needs to start packing up that ridiculous television for his grandmother. It's the least you can do after all the grief you're causing." The audacity was so profound, it was almost hypnotic. She wasn't even hiding it anymore. She was claiming territory. I looked at the OLED TV, then back at the woman who thought she could trade a plate of pancakes for my life's work. The nausea was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline spark of something I hadn't felt in years. "Get out," I said. My voice was quiet, but it vibrated with a force that made Artyom flinch. "Excuse me?" Svetlana hissed. "Both of you, out of my house, now." Svetlana didn't move. Instead, she let out a sharp, dry laugh that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. She walked over to the dining table, pulled out my favorite velvet chair, the one I'd bought to celebrate my first major promotion, and sat down with the poise of a queen on a throne. "Get out?" she repeated, her voice thick with mockery. "Polina, dear, you're becoming hysterical. This is a family matter, and since Artyom and I are the only ones acting like a family, I suggest you take a seat and listen. We aren't going anywhere. In fact, I've already redirected my mail, and the movers for my grandmother's wardrobe will be here at 7 tomorrow morning." I felt a roar of blood in my ears, a rhythmic thumping that made the room pulse. I turned to Artyom. He was leaning against the doorframe, looking everywhere but at me. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to disappear into his own clothes. "Artyom, look at me," I commanded. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was low, vibrating with a coldness that surprised even me. "Did you know about the mail? Did you know she was moving her mother in here?" He finally looked up, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of the man I'd married, guilty, terrified, and small. But it was quickly replaced by a defensive, glassy stare. "Lena, it's just temporary. My grandmother's cottage. It's not safe. The roof really is bad. We have 3 bedrooms. Why shouldn't we help? You're always so focused on your space and your rules. Don't you see how selfish that looks?" "Selfish?" I whispered. The word felt like a physical blow. "I pay the mortgage, Artyom. I pay the property taxes. I paid for the car you drive and the clothes you're wearing right now. I've supported your freelance dreams for 3 years while you find your muse. And now you're telling me I'm selfish because I don't want your mother and grandmother staging a hostile takeover of my home." "It's not a takeover," Svetlana barked, slamming her hand on the table. "It's an adjustment. You have so much, and you give so little of your spirit. Artyom told me how you hold the money over his head, how you make him feel like a guest in his own life. Well, no more. We've made arrangements." A cold stone settled in my stomach. "What arrangements, Svetlana?" She reached into her designer handbag, another gift from me, and pulled out a tablet. With a smug flourish, she swiped the screen and turned it toward me. It was a bank statement. Not hers. Ours. Our joint savings account, the one we called the Future Fund. It was supposed to be for our first child's nursery, for a rainy day, for us. The balance was $4.12. "Where is the money?" I asked, my voice barely audible. $40,000. It had been there last month. My breath hitched, a sharp, stabbing pain blooming in my chest. I felt like I was drowning in plain air. Artyom finally spoke, his voice a pathetic whine. "I had to, Lena. Mom's cottage didn't just have a leak. She owed back taxes. A lot of them. If I didn't pay, they were going to seize it, and she'd be on the street. I was going to tell you, but I knew you'd say no. You always say no to my family. You stole $40,000 from our future to pay for her incompetence." I felt the world fracturing. But then, the first twist dropped, the one that turned my heartbreak into pure, unadulterated fury. "It wasn't just taxes, Artyom. Tell her the rest," Svetlana prompted, her eyes gleaming with a twisted sort of pride. Artyom went pale. "Mom, don't." "Tell her, or I will," Svetlana threatened. She looked at me, a wolfish grin spreading across her face. "My son didn't just give me that money, Polina. He used it to cover his own tracks. Your landscape architect husband hasn't had a client in 8 months. He's been spending his days at the local casino, trying to build our wealth the quick way. He lost $20,000 of his own business loans before he touched your precious savings. I'm the one who covered for him. I'm the one who kept the debt collectors from calling this house." I looked at Artyom, the sketching in the park, the late-night site visits, the exhaustion I thought was from hard work. It was all a lie. He wasn't just a victim of his mother's manipulation. He was a co-conspirator in his own ruin. "Is it true?" I asked. Artyom collapsed onto the floor, his back against the wall, and buried his face in his hands. He started to sob, loud, ugly, performative sounds. "I was going to win it back, Lena. I just needed one good night. I did it for us." "For us?" I stepped toward him, my shadow falling over his shaking form. "You betrayed every single thing we built. You let your mother into our bank account, into our plans, into our bed, practically. And you," I turned to Svetlana, who was calmly checking her manicure, "you knew. You knew he was gambling, and you didn't stop him. You fed the beast so you could use his guilt to get into this house." "I did what a mother does," she said coolly. "I protected my son, and now I'm protecting his future. Since you're clearly going to be difficult, I should mention the renovation papers Artyom mentioned." "The ones I didn't sign?" I spat. "Oh, but you did," Svetlana said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous purr. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her bag. It was the power of attorney draft I'd seen earlier, but this one had a signature at the bottom. My signature. I stared at it. The P was slightly too curved, the L too tall. It was a forgery. A clumsy one, but enough to cause a nightmare in a bank or a government office. "Artyom practiced for weeks," Svetlana whispered, leaning in. "He's quite the artist, isn't he? We've already filed the preliminary paperwork to add my name to the deed. By the time you get a lawyer to prove this is a fake, Grandma will be tucked into the master bedroom and the TV will be mounted in her parlor. You can move into the guest room, Polina, or you can leave. But the house stays with the family." The room felt like it was spinning. My husband was a thief and a forger. My mother-in-law was a squatter and a fraud. My life was being dismantled like a stage set after a play had closed. I looked at the OLED TV, the one Artyom was supposed to pack for Grandma. I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't the sound of breaking, it was the sound of a lock turning. The warmth, the empathy, the being the bigger person, it all evaporated, leaving behind a landscape of cold, hard ice. "I see," I said. I walked over to the kitchen island, picked up my phone and checked the time. 6 o'clock. "What are you doing?" Svetlana asked, her eyes narrowing as she saw the change in my expression. The hysterical woman was gone. In her place was the senior analyst who had dismantled billion-dollar corporate frauds for a living. "You're right, Svetlana," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "This is a family matter, and I've been very neglectful of my family responsibilities." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply walked to the hallway closet and pulled out my heavy winter coat. "Where are you going?" Artyom blubbered from the floor, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "Lena, wait! Let's talk about this. We can make a plan." "The plan is already in motion, Artyom," I said, pausing at the door. I looked at the two of them, the broken man on the floor and the vulture in the velvet chair. "Svetlana, I hope those pancakes were good, because they're the last thing you're ever going to eat in this house." I slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing through the hallway like a gunshot. I had exactly 12 hours before the movers arrived, and I had a lot of phone calls to make. If they wanted to play with the law, I was going to show them exactly how the law felt when it was used as a sledgehammer. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The shaking had stopped. In its place was a stillness so profound, it felt like I had been dipped in liquid nitrogen. I wasn't the golden girl anymore. I was a senior analyst who specialized in forensic accounting and risk assessment. For years, I had been trained to look past the surface, to find the hidden threads of corruption and pull until the whole tapestry unraveled. I had just been too blinded by the idea of family to apply those skills to my own living room. I didn't go to a hotel. I went to my office. The glass and steel building was nearly empty at 7 p.m., the fluorescent lights humming with a sterile, comforting logic. I sat at my desk and opened my private cloud storage. 3 months ago, when Svetlana first started rearranging things, a tiny, instinctual part of me had placed a hidden, motion-activated camera inside the mahogany sideboard. I'd told myself I was just being paranoid about my jewelry. I hit play on the footage from 2 days ago. There they were, Artyom and Svetlana, sitting at my dining table with a stack of my old tax returns spread out like a feast. I watched, my face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitor, as Artyom practiced my signature over and over on a yellow legal pad. I watched Svetlana pat his hand, whispering, "It's for the best, Artyom. She has no heart for tradition. We're just taking back what should have been yours the moment you said, 'I do.'" I didn't blink. I didn't cry. I downloaded the footage, along with 6 months of bank records showing Artyom's business expenses going directly to a digital gambling platform. Then, I called Elena, my closest friend and a ruthless divorce attorney who lived for cases like this. "Polina?" Her voice crackled over the speaker. "It's late. Is everything okay?" "I need you to file for an emergency restraining order and an ex-parte motion for exclusive possession of the marital residence," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "And call Detective Miller. Tell him I have high-definition video of a felony forgery in progress." The next morning at 6:45 a.m., I was standing on my doorstep. I wasn't alone. 2 uniformed officers stood behind me, and a locksmith was already kneeling at the door, his tools clinking softly. The air was crisp, smelling of damp pavement and the neighbor's jasmine. The door clicked open. Inside, the house was a hive of activity. A massive cardboard crate sat in the middle of the foyer, the TV. Svetlana was draped in my silk kimono, the one my grandfather had brought back from Kyoto, barking orders at a confused-looking Artyom who was struggling with a roll of bubble wrap. "I told you, Artyom, use the heavy-duty tape," she snapped. Then she saw me. She didn't even have the grace to look startled. She just adjusted the lapels of my robe and smirked. You're early, Polina. I hope you've come to your senses and brought the keys to the storage unit. We need more room for the grandmother's china. I walked into the center of the room, my heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. Officers, I said, gesturing toward the woman in my robe. That is the woman I reported for trespassing and conspiracy to commit fraud. And that man, I pointed to Artyom, who had turned the color of curdled milk, is the one who forged my signature on a power of attorney document to steal $40,000. Artyom dropped the tape. It skittered across the floor, the only sound in the sudden, deafening silence. Lena, wait! What are you doing? We're family! Family doesn't forge signatures, Artyom, I said, and family doesn't gamble away a nursery fund. Svetlana stepped forward, her face contorting into a mask of pure venom. You think you're so smart? We have the papers. We filed them yesterday. This is Artyom's house now, and you're just a guest we've decided to evict. One of the officers stepped forward, holding out a hand. Ma'am, we have a court-ordered stay of execution on any property transfers involving this address, and a warrant to seize all electronic devices. We also have a video of the signing ceremony. Would you like to see it, or would you like to put your hands behind your back? Svetlana's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. She turned to Artyom, her eyes wild. Do something! Tell them she's lying! Artyom did nothing. He stood there, paralyzed, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He didn't look at his mother, and he didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, a hollowed-out shell of a man who had finally run out of lies to hide behind. In the silence that followed, I realized that I didn't even hate him anymore. You don't hate a shadow. You just wait for the light to come and wash it away. I gave you everything, I said, walking up to him. I was so close I could see the sweat beating on his forehead. I gave you a home, a future, and my absolute trust. You traded it all for a seat at a virtual poker table and a mother who treats you like a puppet. Lena, please, he whispered, a single tear escaping. The locksmith is changing the codes today, I continued, ignoring his plea. Your things will be in trash bags on the curb by noon. If you or your mother set foot on this sidewalk again, you'll be violating a restraining order. And Svetlana? I turned to the woman who was now being led toward the door by an officer. She looked small now, her bravado stripped away, the stolen kimono hanging off her shoulders like a shroud. The pancakes were a bit dry, I said. You might want to work on that in the holding cell. The retribution was swift and clinical. Because I had the video evidence, the forgery charges stuck. Artyom received a suspended sentence and a mountain of court-ordered restitution that would take him 20 years to pay back. Svetlana, found to be the mastermind behind the fraudulent filing, spent 6 months in a minimum security facility, a far cry from the premium suite she had envisioned for her grandmother. 6 months later, I sat on my balcony. The sun was setting, painting the historic district in shades of honey and violet. The house was quiet, but it wasn't a lonely quiet. It was a clean quiet. The OLED TV was back on its mount, but it hadn't been turned on in weeks. I preferred the sound of the wind in the trees and the scratch of my own pen on a notepad as I planned a solo trip to Japan. The espresso machine hissed in the kitchen, and the smell of fresh coffee, just for one, filled the air. I looked at the spot on the floor where Artyom had collapsed, where the bubble wrap had once screeched. There was no trace of them left. I had scrubbed the floors, repainted the walls, and given every piece of family furniture to a local shelter. I picked up my cup, the warmth of the ceramic seeping into my palms. I had lost a husband and a substantial amount of money, but I had gained something far more valuable. I had rediscovered the woman who didn't need a golden life to be whole. I took a sip of the coffee, looking out over the city I had reclaimed. Some people think a home is made of walls and memories, but they're wrong. A home is made of the boundaries you're willing to defend. I set the cup down and smiled at the empty room. My life was finally my own again, and for the first time in years, the silence sounded like music.